Hello everyone, welcome again to the channel. Today I want to share with you this information about the NATO chief says that Ukraine shouldn't drop its goal of driving Russia out of Crimea, and what this means. So this comes from an interview with the Washington Post NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. That's what he was saying. So in synthesis, he was saying Ukraine shouldn't avoid declaring ambitious war aims of driving Russia out of the eastern Donbass and the Crimean Peninsula, and in general all of the occupied territories that Russia has currently, including Kherson Oblast, which is north of Crimea. All of these are vital regions for Russia, so that's why the strategy has focused on these areas. Kherson is vital for Crimea because if you know, when Crimea was independent from Ukraine, the first things that Ukraine did was to block the access to fresh water for the Crimean Peninsula, and this was devastating for agriculture and for everything else in the peninsula. So Kherson Oblast is in this region which has access to the water that goes to Crimea. So this area will never be given up by Russia. That's just strategic. But let's pay attention to what he's saying, because it's kind of interesting what they say. He says they have the right to say that they are fighting for the whole of Ukraine. And he says this is the part that is more interesting. He says NATO should be prepared to provide Ukraine with long-term support for its fight against Russia. So why should NATO be prepared to provide Ukraine? Ukraine is not a NATO member, but we will see that they are, considering Ukraine as if it was a de facto member. So this is what it says here. Now let's take into consideration this last part. This comes from Ukrainian Defense Minister Odysee Reznikov, and he was saying that the Kiev regime needs more weapons to mount a sufficient counterattack and kick Russia outside of their country to liberate all occupied territory. So this is what the Ukrainian Defense Minister wants. So basically what he's saying is that all the weapons they have given Ukraine, they are not enough to mount a counterattack. And let's pay attention to this additional information. This is the basically, going into more detail to what he was saying, Ukraine's defense minister. The amounts and types of weapons the United States and other NATO members are sending to Ukraine are not enough to eject Russian armed forces and win the war. So this is the reality of this, and this goes with conflicting war aims. So let's take a look at what they are saying here. So he's acknowledging that they have given Ukraine some weapons, and he says, but they are not enough to expel Russian forces or to deter future strikes on Europe. So this is warmongering. This last part, deter future strikes in Europe, is kind of trying to sell the idea that Russia will invade other countries in Europe, so they need to give more weapons to Ukraine, because there is this strange concept that somehow Ukraine is the shield of Europe and they are protecting everyone, and that was why they were expecting the European Union to welcome them with open arms, because they are sacrificing themselves for everyone else, basically. And all these declarations are in this event that was GlobSec Bratislava Forum. And he was saying something else. He says, we need to liberate our land as soon as possible. To do that, we need heavy weapons. And he goes into detail about what kind of weapons, but he says we need artillery, tanks, aviation, anti-ship complexes, new UAVs, anti-aircraft, anti-missile defense systems. We need them fast. We need them in the numbers matching the scope of the challenge we face. So he's not incorrect about all this. The main thing is that all these things, they are not coming as fast as they should. And he even says so here, Ukraine has been inadequately armed or supported since the beginning of the war. Western donations have come too slowly. And he says they need new and different weapons for the evolving battlefield. We need weapons and munitions and military equipment of the NATO standard to replace the Soviet ones. He said the Ukrainian military also needs training, spare parts, and maintenance capabilities or agreements. So all this requires a lot of time. A lot of time, even if they get to have the amounts of weapons they want. The main thing is that especially they need training, and training takes time. This is why Ukraine is losing the war, and that's why it's very difficult for Ukraine to overturn the result of the war currently, because training takes a lot of time, and it is time that Ukraine doesn't have. And he also mentions something here like spare parts, maintenance capabilities, or agreements. So what he means is that if they send a tank and the tank gets destroyed or damaged, they need spare parts to repair that tank. And currently there are no places in Ukraine where these repairs can take place. So there are some agreements with the NATO countries that are providing this kind of support. Openly, this makes them parties to the conflict, but Russia has shown a lot of restraint in this area and has chosen not to consider them parties to the conflict, even though they are doing everything that a party to the conflict does. They are repairing basically weapon systems, vehicles, all kinds of things. They are providing training to Ukrainian soldiers to use these systems that the West is providing. So all of this is making them parties to the conflict. What makes a party to the conflict is that they become legitimate targets for Russia to attack. Why Russia has chosen not to do it? Like I say, they are showing restraint, but that doesn't mean that they are not participating. They are not making themselves parties to this conflict. So this is a provocation. But let's pay attention to this part here that says Western leaders have said that these weapons are meant to give Ukraine the best possible defense and negotiating position, not for expelling Russian forces from Ukrainian territory. So this will explain why the kind of weapons they have been sending, the amounts of weapons, and the pace at which these weapon systems have arrived to Ukraine have really this intention. They don't want Ukraine to win the war. They just want Ukraine to kind of tolerate the invasion, stall it at best, but certainly they cannot win with this kind of strategy. They cannot win with this kind of tactical activities. They are completely open about this, and this comes from Derek Chollet, State Department counselor, in an interview for the Defense One radio podcast. He said, The Ukrainians have been very clear to us. They are seeking to defend their country, defend their territory, defend their sovereignty. They're not seeking offensive capability to go after Russia. So what is curious to me is where this guy Derek Chollet got his information. I've never heard of any Ukrainian officer or official saying that they are not seeking offensive capability. From the start, they say they want to kick out Russia out of the territory and even regain previously held territories like Crimea and the Donbas Republic, so they are not going to give anything up. I don't know where that guy got his information, but it's curious to see that this matches exactly what we see, the developments we see now in the ground. And this comes from this guy, Prime Minister. This is the Latvian Prime Minister. He says, I'm convinced of one thing, that if we want long-term peace and security in Europe, there is only one way to attain that, and that is through a Russian loss in this war and Ukrainian victory. Latvian Prime Minister said, anything other than a clear loss for Russia will simply mean Russia licking its war wounds, retooling and building its army, and sooner or later, in 1 year, in 2 years, who knows, advancing once again in Ukraine or elsewhere. So like I said before, this is again just warmongering, and this article is very detailed, is very interesting. You should read it if you have the opportunity, but what I wanted to mention here is the importance of how things are currently happening. You know, one thing we need to pay attention is that Ukraine is not a NATO member, yet they are receiving this kind of support that usually goes to a NATO member, except for the military involvement of all NATO members. So they are not involved because they are not sending their own soldiers to participate in the conflict, but other than that, that's what they are doing. So in my opinion, this is the kind of support that countries such as Sweden and Finland will receive if in a hypothetical scenario, you know, Russia was going to, let's say, invade Finland or invade Sweden. This is the kind of support they will receive. They are not NATO members, so nobody is going to fight for them. They are going to send them as many weapons as they can to defend their territory, but that will not be the same kind of response that will come from full NATO involvement. This is my opinion, but as you can see here, this explains a lot, and it says why all these systems are being sent with the speed or with the pace that they are being sent. This is the kind of systems that are being sent. These systems are probably good. I'm not saying they're not correct or good for any particular battlefield. They're just not coming in the numbers they say, you know, they need. For example, the MLRS. Before the war started, Ukraine had probably about 1,000 of these multiple launch rocket systems. So if the United States is about to send 1,000 of those, it's not going to change absolutely anything, apart from the fact that there are different systems, more advanced systems, and they need a lot of training, and they need capable soldiers to take the training. So that takes a lot of time, and like I said, it's time that is against Ukraine. So this is exactly what we see here. More warmongering. They are just trying to prolong the war, and they don't care if the Russian soldiers are destroyed, the Ukrainian soldiers are destroyed, people are dying, you know, defenseless civilians are dying. They don't care about it. They are just having their own goals, and which are very selfish. Some people speculate that it's all about the weapon sales, and certainly the companies that are selling the weapons are making a big profit out of this. But let's pay attention to what is really happening here. Russia is not going to get back on what they already occupied, and there was some speculation by someone that says that one option was that NATO became involved and created some kind of buffer zone in the west of Ukraine. That will be direct involvement in the war, and Russia has repeatedly said they will not tolerate that. This happened in a third country like Syria, where there are US troops in a part of Syria that are occupying it against the will of the legitimate government of Syria. They are doing this just to control territory that is key, strategic to the country. But if they do this in Ukraine, it will not have the same kind of response. In this case, Russia didn't involve their troops in try to fight or kick out these troops from these U.S. troops on this section of the country. But it's my opinion that this will not have the same response if they were intending to do this in Ukraine. Certainly, that will become a big provocation, and that will have a different result than what we saw in Syria. This is my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comment section. And as always, I ask you to please like the video, share it in social media, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you again very soon. Thank you for watching.